picked that especially for Pete because there were no big, huge, long Hebrew names that he would have to struggle with. I have been here about 3 years this past July 31st. And I wasn't here 2 weeks that Ben didn't get up in the announcements and say something to the effect that they were still looking for a preacher. I thought in 3 years we'd get through that. I still have work yet to do because he still is thinking just when I leave. And what I'm going to do when I get back from our little jaunt here Monday, I'm going to go right straight to his house and tell him I'm back and I'm still here. Now, after that, I'll ask the elders whether I'm still hired, but I'm going to him first to be sure that he knows I'm still here. Just to keep you honest. All right. Sometimes can't get a break, that's the way it is. In this text we're looking at today in Matthew 15, you kind of get this sense that Jesus he's just looking for a break, and it's just so hard to get one. By the way, I don't know whether you're familiar with this or not, but how many of you think that conflict and controversy and argumentation is something pleasant and fun? There's so few of us that do. I don't either, really. As a matter of fact, it's quite trying. It's quite depleting. It is, especially mentally, I think, psychologically, it is tiring to be in those kinds of circumstances. And Jesus, with all he is doing, is beginning to come across a lot of conflict and controversy. We talked about it last week and the week before. In fact, when you look at Matthew 15, it starts with an argument with Pharisees. And Jesus is getting fed up and tired with it. And he's telling them, y'all guys are being stubborn and bullheaded, and it's time for me to just tell you the truth of the way it is. And he does so. And that causes lots of anxiety, and it causes lots of depletion, and you get tired of it. And so he leaves the region in which he is preaching to go off into a region, Tyre and Sidon, where maybe, because there's a thicker population of Gentiles up there, his burden might be lighter. Not the case. He goes up to a house up there, Mark 7 tells us, and in the house he can't even keep from people. They're still all over him up there. And during the course of that time, and I don't know whether they were coming into the house or being, let into the house so that they could talk to Jesus or present Jesus with this, that, and the other, to listen to him teach. I don't know what all the circumstances was, but at a certain point in time, this woman from Canaan, a Canaanite woman, not a Jew, she was a Gentile all the way, but she had heard that Jesus was in the neighborhood, and she went to him. Now, I can't imagine. In fact, I can't imagine what you might be willing to do for your child. When you love your kids, you just almost sacrifice everything, or you would sacrifice nearly everything in order for your kids to be safe. And I've sat many times through my preaching career with parents whose children are deathly ill, sick. I've done funerals for children, and I have to tell you, it is the most unpleasant thing in the world to stand before grieving parents, especially a mother, and try to say words of comfort when they have lost a child. And I don't believe there are any, frankly, but that's a task set before you sometimes. I admire this lady knowing her daughter's possessed of demons and saying, I'm going to do whatever it takes to get things done here. I know this guy can do things. I've heard about his power and what he can do, and I'm going to go find out. And so she tracks him down, goes into his house, and yes, Jesus is trying to catch a break, but he doesn't. But she finally goes to him, and there are several lessons that can be learned here. And the first thing I want to do is put some stuff into context, because we have to understand that Jesus, and I've heard people argue this, which they're deadly wrong. Jesus was not being cruel to her. There was a common sense of separation between the Jewish and the Gentile people. And if you just think that's a Gentile mentality, you're wrong. In fact, it's an interesting phenomenon, sociologically speaking. Many folks who are discriminated against are more and aware of the fact they are discriminated against and know where they stand in a hierarchy of society as well or better than those who discriminate against them. And that's just the way of it. And so there's no doubt in this woman's mind. She is understanding she's not a Jew. Now, what some have said is that Jesus was extremely dismissive, because if you look in verse 23, the first response we see of Jesus, and I don't know whether this event took place in the house or right outside the house in which he was in. Mark said he was in a house when this all occurred, but nevertheless, it says he answered her not a word. It just might sound dismissive, but it's not, and I'm going to explain why that's the case here in a moment. But there are some who have said, yeah, Jesus was a little cold-hearted here. Not only did he ignore her, but then a little later on, he said something to the effect, you're a dog. Well, no, that's not correct either. In fact, the matter, Jesus, that's not the nature of Jesus. Look at the things that he was doing. Look at the people who were coming to him. If he was dismissive, if he was harsh on people who were needy and not up to the stock and standard of the culture of that time, who did he deal with? Why, the folks that came to him were not the rulers of the synagogue, not the rich of society. No, it was quite the contrary. The people who searched him out were people who didn't have standing for whatever reason. That's who searched him out. This does not reflect, if he's being harsh and ignoring her and being cruel, this does not flesh out with the rest of what Jesus does throughout his entire life on this planet. Okay? So that can't possibly be it. So now we have to look more deeply into the text and understand, why did he do this? Let me offer this obvious conclusion to you. There are times when Jesus allows someone to try a little harder. Just previously in this chapter, and we're talking about levels of faith here, and how God wants us to have great faith, which this woman gets. That's a punchline later on, a little spoiler there. But he wants her to have great faith. But how is that possible unless the opportunity arises where the faith can be challenged? You can't, we live in something that's just awesome comfort and ease and, sitting back on the leather sofa. That's not stressful. That's not going to challenge us. As a matter of fact, we are not going to progress physically if all we do is sit all day. That's not going to happen. We have to get up. We have to push ourselves. Mike's walking and running around right now up and down the halls over at Focus Care. He doesn't do that just by accident. It's a strain. It's a struggle. Jimmy's working against pain all the time, but he's here. There's all kinds of examples sitting here this morning. You know that there's some pain involved to get ahead, to push. No pain, no gain. We've heard that before. It works the same spiritually. Jesus never promised us cushions and clouds and beautiful rainbows and unicorns when we become Christians. Oh, quite the contrary. He said you're going to suffer persecution. You're going to have a hard go of it. That's the way of it. Why? Because it tests your faith, James tells us in the first chapter. Tests our faith, makes us stronger. And that's what he's doing here. And here's a woman who has come to him, and she understands the dichotomy between the Jew and the Gentile. And she's probably basically kind of showing her, you're coming to me, and us Jews, you don't like us Jews. Most Gentiles did not. They viewed Jews as those arrogant guys that think they're better than us, and here you are asking me a favor. What's he doing? Well, he's testing her faith. It's right here close in this context too. It's ironic, I think, that just prior to this, Peter says, "Oh Lord, if that's you, let me come out and walk on the water to you." And Jesus said, "Bring it." And so Peter gets out of the boat, and then all of a sudden, he looks around and he discovers, ooh, this is getting rough out here, and he starts sinking. And the very same words, "Lord, save me." And what's Jesus' response to him as he grabs him by the arm and pulls him out of the water? "Oh, you have great faith?" No. Where's your faith at, Peter? I'll tell you, sometimes we think of ourselves as blessed and honored, and we are, because we are God's children, but it doesn't make us one whit better than the fella out there who doesn't even know he needs Jesus. We don't have more value than that fella out there. We just happen to have somebody that cared enough about us to tell us about Christ so that we could respond positively and change the way our life is, but even more, change our eternity. Don't we owe that to someone out there? This lady came knowing Jesus had some power. And Jesus is testing her a little bit here. In fact, he even tells her, I'm here because I'm trying to speak to the house of Israel. I was not sent, he says in verse 24, except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Now, before we get too far off into a ditch, let's understand what he is actually saying here. Because if I understand John 3:16 correctly, and I believe I do, and I believe the context verifies this, when Jesus came, God gave his Son for the entire world. I know there's a lot of doctrine around that talks about how selective God is. That Jesus came only for a certain elect bunch, and that's not true. He came for the whole world, that if you believe, you should not perish. And so he came for everyone. It's not that this Gentile woman was not part of that plan, okay? That's not what he's saying. But what he is saying is something that goes on all throughout the New Testament, which I think sometimes we just kind of forget. I want you to notice something like Romans 1:16. In Romans 1:16, we have a statement there made by Paul that basically says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God. Now, did you catch this part? To the Jew first and also to the Greek. We browse through that just flying like crazy and say, oh yes, he came to save us. But did y'all realize where we get the second medal? We're the blue. We're not the blue ribbon. We're the red ribbon. Okay, we're silver medal. We're the second place. Does that bother you? It shouldn't, because God's special people were the ones he came to. Now the question should be, why then did he come to the Jew first and also to the Greek? I'll let you in on a little secret in some of my ministry as I have worked throughout the preaching career for a long while. Anytime I moved to a place, like I did here in Hamilton, I did it in Comanche, I did it in Jacksboro, I did it every place I've been. First thing I do is when I go in, I try to find out who used to be a member here. And there's a reason for that. And I want you to look at 2 Peter with me just a minute. Turn over in your Bibles to 2 Peter. I'm going to read something here as to why that is the case. Because there is a priority that we need to understand to be divine. This is God's order of things. And you can't read Romans 1:16 and not understand there's an order to things, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Okay? Don't let that bother you, because there's a reason why that's the case. The Jews were God's people. How many times does Jesus tell God's people as he comes to them, y'all should know this, quoting from their own prophets. Your prophets told you this was coming. This has been predicted since the beginning. The proto-evangelium of Genesis 3:15. God's going to bruise Satan's head because of this seed, this perfect being. And that's Jesus the Christ. And he's going to come through Abraham by that promise. And therefore the Israelites were there as God's people to carry this promise through so you and I could have salvation. What happens when somebody who has that leg up, who has that special optimum position, what happens when they quit on things like they did with Jesus? How do you compare that with somebody who never knew, ever, at all, anything? How do you make a connection? Notice in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 20. This tells us why there was an optimum urgency for Jesus to reach the Jews as opposed to Gentiles. Notice what he said. For if after they have escaped the pollution of the world through the knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. He's talking about Christians who have become Christians. They've escaped the pollutions of the world. Now they're clean. They're washed, 1 Corinthians 6:11. They're washed. They're clean. Okay? They've escaped that. And they are again tangled, after they've escaped that, in them and overcome. The latter end is worse for them than the beginning. Now, I know it's difficult to understand how there can be levels in hell. Some's worse than others, because I don't want to go to hell anywhere. I want to go to heaven. If I get me a little tiny corner in heaven, I'll be happy. Okay? But nevertheless, there is some detriment. There's some level. And we're going to discuss that in a minute. Oh, that's a spoiler alert. Yeah. Great faith. That means there's a weak faith. Yeah, that was Peter. Yeah, there are levels of faith. And so you read in here, the position that a person has when they know the truth and they fall from it is not the same as somebody who's never known the truth at all. Those two situations are different. So he goes on and says, and here's the definition of it, For it would have been better for them not to have known the way of righteousness than having known it, to turn from the holy commandment delivered to them. And then he gives an analogy that's rather grotesque. But divinely speaking, this is the way God views those who are his children who turn away. But it has happened to them according to the true proverb, a dog returns to his own vomit, and a sow having washed and wallowing in the mire. Now, what situation do you think would be the priority when you come and tell someone the good news? Well, all throughout my career, the first thing I do when I sign up with a congregation to work with a congregation, I want to find who is missing first. Because their situation is worse than those that I can evangelize in the community and get to know in the community and talk to them about Jesus and who he is and what he wants us to do and how you can go to heaven. Those who already know that and don't bother to come and worship and assemble and encourage the church and be a good reflection of a Christian, those are the ones I need to talk to first, because their soul is worse off than those who have never heard, if you can even imagine how that could be. There's a divine order here that Jesus is talking about in Matthew 15. It has nothing to do with the fact that one is more valuable than the other. No, Jesus came for all. And so what he is merely explaining to her is, I came here because God's people are way out in left field. They're not even expecting a Messiah that God has predicted. And here I am, and I'm being rejected. And so yes, my priority is them. Now what is phenomenal here, and what is a lesson for you and I, is when your faith is tested. What's your faith look like? Is it a weak faith like Peter, where you need Jesus' hand to drag you out of that water that you just start drowning in? Or are you going to be persevering and pressing forward and urgent? Are you going to push to find Christ and to make him a part of your life? Is your faith weak, or is it great? Because when your faith gets tested, how do you stand? Do you pass the test? Maybe we ought to go back to, since school's starting here shortly, if it hadn't already, for some. Do you pass the test? I don't know how you are about tests. I don't like tests. All tests do is show me how dumb I am, which doesn't take a lot, but it certainly isn't a pleasant thing to be found dumb. But you know what? Tests they're good. I mean, as a teacher, and I've been a teacher on certain occasions, on occasion. As a teacher, tests are wonderful because it's not so much knowing that your student is not very sharp. That's not really the point of tests. And that maybe is where we have a self-consciousness we ought not to have. You know, a test is really effective for the teacher, because the teacher can find out, am I doing a good job, or am I failing in my job as a teacher because my students just don't get it? And if you got an average in your class of a D-, I'm not sure it's the student's problem. And so tests can be very good. And they can cause us to be stronger, cause us to take note, take stock in who we are and what we're about. And Peter didn't pass real well. I think he got a C-. He was just barely there. Okay? But I guarantee you this lady, she puts us all to shame. Because when Jesus points out there is a division between us, and yes, in the Jewish culture, we think of you as dogs, or at least the culture does. He wasn't approving of that. He was merely showing that in the culture that I live in, that's how these people think of these people. He didn't approve of it. And this lady, by the way, I want you to note, did not deny that. You know, before we get all upset that Jesus put her down, she didn't deny it at all. She agreed with him. Yes, Lord, that is a fact. Look at verse 27. When he says, it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the little dogs. And she said, yes, Lord, that is true. I'll have no argument with that. You know, sometimes I think we get so caught up in our rights and our ego that we think we're somebody, and anybody ever says anything negative about us, we all of a sudden get defensive. What? Who are you to judge me? Who are you to point out what is wrong? Instead of being very objective about it and looking at what is being pointed out and ask the question, are they right? Is this a flaw I need to look at? Maybe I should agree immediately, yes, you're right, that is wrong. I do need to correct that. By the way, if anybody ever wants to really ride your case and give you grief and they state something that is correct as far as a flaw in your personality, you know how to pop that balloon immediately? Is to immediately say, you know you're right. I do have that flaw and I'm trying to work on it hard. Would you help me? You want to see the countenance of a person just droop right immediately, because all of a sudden, I told you so and I got you, just disappears out of the equation. Because they realize, you know what, this person really loves the truth, and I can't get to anybody that loves the truth because they are going to repair them. In fact, my pointing some flaw out is going to help them. And that's the exact opposite of what somebody is trying to do when they're pointing out your flaws and trying to be mean. Well, if they point out your flaws and you immediately say, you know what, that's right, I need to work on that. Will you help me work on that? Immediately, their end game just got smeared, taken off the map. Because what you're trying to do is become a better Christian. This lady had no problem with this. Yes, Lord, you're right. We are the dogs concerning your culture, and that's what you think of us. But here's the truth about my faith. I know you can help me. And I can put aside the culture that surrounds us. I can put aside the pettiness that goes on in our culture. And I can look to you, and I know you can do something for me. It's little wonder that Jesus would look at this woman and say, I haven't seen this in Israel. You have great faith. So be it. Of course, in Mark it tells us she went home and the daughter was totally free of the demon, lying in her bed, no problems. And what this brings to mind is something, and I guess it'll shame us a little bit, shames me. Hopefully it'll have the same impact on you. But isn't it embarrassing for you and I as Christians, faithful, solid, following Christ, when we see those who make really no claim to Christianity whatsoever, and their conduct and their attitude and their speech is better than ours? You know, that's kind of an embarrassment. As a matter of fact, that was a problem with the Jews for many, many moons all the way back in their history, where the prophets would say, you know, there's people out here doing better than you, and they don't even know God like you know God. In Corinth, Paul in chapter 5 tells the Corinthian Christians, you got a situation in the church here where a guy marries his stepmother, and y'all are defending it while the Gentiles don't even stoop that low. How embarrassing for us when we can't conduct ourselves as Christians should, when we take on worldly conduct and speech, where others who are not Christians look at us and say, I wouldn't even say that, and they're calling themselves a Christian. You know, this must have been an embarrassment for those disciples around who were telling him, let's get rid of this woman, Lord, let's move her out of the house. And that didn't happen, and she ended up, and I don't know whether this was especially hard for Peter, because it hadn't been too long before that when Peter was sinking in the water and called out to the Lord, save me. And here is a woman he would have looked down on. Do you recall Galatians where Paul reprimanded Peter? Because, you know, they were out preaching the gospel for every creature, and then a bunch of Jews from Jerusalem came up to one of the churches there in Galatia, and Peter decided he needs to be holy and be a Jew as well as a Christian, and so he backed off of some of his Gentile brethren, and Paul called him out publicly, saying, why, you hypocrite, look at what you're doing here. You're not being the Christian like Christ that you should be. Isn't it embarrassing for us when people who are not religious much, or not really serious about it much, and their conduct and speech is better than ours? How embarrassing for us. You know, and a crowd ought to be able to pick out a Christian, and ought to be able to pick out a Christian because it's so obvious that they're there. If you want to use that sliding method that so many use, I want to go to 2 Corinthians 10 to close this sermon out, because very often it is the case we tend to do this. We compare ourselves with others. And on so many occasions, this turns out well because of our education in Christ, because of the fellowship we have with other Christians who will encourage us and make us better. And all of a sudden, we believe that we're somebody now. And that's a flawed position. Paul would say in 2 Corinthians, the 10th chapter, notice in verse 12, he condemned the Corinthians for this, okay? For we dare not class ourselves or compare ourselves with those who commend themselves, but they, measuring themselves by themselves and comparing themselves among themselves, are not wise. You know what? You can always find somebody that's not as good as you and feel good about yourself. And that is such a horrible position to take. If you want to compare yourself to somebody, compare yourself to this lady. How do y'all turn out? How's your faith this morning? Is it great enough that you give anything and everything for Christ? Because you know He's got the fix for what ails you, whatever it is. By the way, in the bottom of that chapter 10, verse 18 in 2 Corinthians, chapter 10, verse 18, for not he who commends himself is approved, but whom the Lord commends. My question for you this morning, how's your faith this morning, and how would Jesus rate it? Is it weak like Peter's when he was reaching out of the water going, oh, I'm going down? Or is it strong like this woman who says, it doesn't matter what you say, what people think, how the culture values me, I know my Lord can do these things for me. How's your faith? That's a serious question for us to contemplate. We always sing an invitation song. It's not intended for somebody just to walk down the aisle and vent their life issues. That's not the purpose of it. As a matter of fact, I would recommend that you respond to the invitation within yourself, understanding here is an example that Jesus set before God's people, telling her very testingly, you don't rate like God's people do, because God's people need this, and they did worse than she did. Sometimes we need to be told, this is what you need, because your faith isn't where it ought to be. If it isn't, respond to the invitation within yourself to make yourself a better person this week by imbibing the Word of God so that your faith will be strengthened and you will be better, so that God can look at you as Jesus did this woman and say, great is your faith. We offer the invitation.